PortTech LA has been a godsend for startup companies and entrepreneurs like ourselves. Our products were first exhibited at the PortTech Expo just this past September, and we got great exposure for our new emissions testing, measurement, and monitoring products. And let's talk about that for a second. Our positioning for the industry is total regulatory compliance. So what does that mean? That affects all of us in this room, because as we've seen, regulations to regulate pollution and reduce emissions started in the 70s with automobiles. We've moved into trucks and buses, and now it's kind of the crosshairs of the industry are on the maritime marketplace. And regulations are becoming more and more stringent, and solutions are now coming into the marketplace that can help us handle the challenges that we face. So if you look at it, we've got not one, not two, but three government entities that are involved in this. And of course that's very interesting, because that makes it an even bigger challenge. You've got the US EPA, you've got the International Maritime Organization at the international level, part of the United Nations, and then of course at the state level you have the California Air Resources Board. So what that creates is a potential nightmare for those of us who participate in this industry. I can see some heads nodding here. And even for the ports, who have to wend their way amongst the regulations to effectively meet those regulations while doing their jobs. And of course, what drives that is the fact that this is an international business that we're in. All of us who participate in the port activities, whether it's here in California or around the world, know that we're in an internationally based business. The ports of call around the world are now all being affected. And as many of you know, in January of 2012, an emissions control area was established around the entire coastline of North America, which extends out 200 nautical miles. So that means that as any vessel over 500 tons coming into that area must now comply with the regulations. But guess what? We also have in California the state that has a 24 nautical mile limit for its set of regulations. So now we've got factors which impact all of us who are participating in this. So what you have then is these entities, California Air Resources Board, EPA, IMO, that have various regulations, such as the 24 nautical mile limit for 0.1% sulfur fuel, the international level for NOx emissions for EPA and IMO. And then of course you've got coming in to 2016 the reduction in NOx emissions that will be a requirement as well. So you've got these challenges that are facing those of us who are in this industry to meet those regulations. And of course that can be done in a variety of ways, such as Rick mentioned with cold ironing, or other technologies such as scrubbers. John mentioned that it looks like there may be $15 billion worth of scrubbers just to reduce the sulfur dioxide emissions coming from the fuels, the high sulfur fuels that are being used by these ocean-going vessels. So the question then becomes, how do we verify, how do we certify? Rick mentioned this in his remarks. How do we verify and certify what those new technologies are doing for us from an emissions point of view? And the good news about this is, instead of having three different kinds of solutions to measure, verify, certify, we actually have in effect one. What has happened is that in 2012 in June, the California Air Resources Board came out with a set of guidelines for testing and verifying and certifying emissions from ocean-going vessels. And they focused on a particular type of test protocol called the ISO 8178 test protocol, which I won't bore you with. But what it does is it sets in place a method by which a technology can be certified in terms of its emissions. And the IMO and the EPA have also centered their certification around that same test protocol. So that's the good news for all of us that are now working in this particular area. But the fact is that there hasn't been a solution. There hasn't been any commercial product available that meets those regulations. That is until now, and that's what GreenLink Systems is all about. So what we've done is that we focused on our products on those regulations where they intersect, which is right there at that particular ISO test protocol, to provide that solution for verifying and certifying these new technologies. And of course, that's fine, but why do we need to do that? Well, the fact is that the regulators are starting to tighten the screws. And what they're doing is that the EPA, in conjunction with the Coast Guard, are now creating essentially the incentives, if you will, to comply. And that incentive is basically fining you, and if you don't comply with things like the fuel requirements in these emission control areas. And those fines are ranging into hundreds of thousands of dollars. Let's face it, the actual statute says that a fine can be $25,000 per day per engine for any engine that does not comply with those emissions requirements. And that can add up when you consider the fact that there are at least are an average of about 10 engines on board a large vessel that are 175 horsepower or greater. So that's a real bite on to owners and operators of vessels that call on our ports. So what we've done is that we've created a series of products that essentially meet all of the requirements for exhaust gas measurement and testing, monitoring those emissions, continuous monitoring of them, and then we've added in, of course, all the 21st century requirements that you need, which is software, database reporting, internet-based up and down reporting and alerting, and all of this designed specifically for the maritime environment. So what we have is products that meet the MARPOL requirements, which, as you know, stands for marine pollution, which is the subset group of the International Maritime Organization responsible for these regulations. So meeting those requirements is critical. And there really hasn't been a solution on the market yet, until now, that can meet those requirements. And so it's no longer the point where you can take an existing handheld emission monitoring or measurement device and check out your emissions on your engine. It really comes down to verifiable, certifiable, acceptable data for the regulators, for those three different entities. That's really critical. So when you get into the guts of equipment like the type that we have, this is a picture of one of our continuous emission monitoring devices, the insides of it. Well, that's fine, but if you look on the left-hand side, that's one section, one small paragraph of the MARPOL NOx technical code. And it says they're very specific on what is required to measure and monitor those emissions. For example, the sample of the gas that you're taking has to be going through a heated sample line. It must be it must be have a heated filter. It must have a heated sampling pump, etc. So there are very specific requirements that must be met in order to provide acceptable data to the regulatory bodies, and that's what it's all about. We also have an emission testing unit that is essentially a lab on wheels. You have to look at it this way, folks. The way that we're going in terms of the maritime environment, at least the way we see it going, is that you all know about smog check for cars. We all here in California have to deal with those smog check stations. Well, you can't drive a ship into a smog check station, can you? Well, what we're doing is we're bringing a smog check laboratory on wheels to the ship that meets all of the requirements of the regulatory authorities, both the IMO, yes, the EPA, and the California level. So that's what's critical is that you have to now step up to the higher level of essentially laboratory grade emissions data in order to comply. The other thing that's important for us as far as what we think that customers will need is online capability. The ability to not only know wherever you may be, if you're an owner, operator, or possibly even a port authority person, to know what's happening on board that vessel with that particular engine, and to be alerted if there are any issues from an emissions point of view. So our vision is that every ship will have the ability to self-report itself to owner-operators so that they can comply because they want to. It's not that we're all tree huggers here, or that we're on the opposite side of the fence where we don't give a darn. It's we want to comply, we want to be responsible citizens and responsible business people. So what's necessary is to alert them, to have that kind of ongoing, precise measurement that they can use to then be in compliance with the regulations. So what we've done is we've had a 21st century essentially ability now to report over the cell phone, over an iPad, or over the internet in the office. So the way we look at it, when it comes to compliance, what we'd like to see is an owner-operator having essentially a dashboard so that they can see as their vessels are coming into port, do they comply? It's as simple as a red light or a green light reporting system, whether it's for the California Air Resources Board requirement or whether it's the IMO requirement. So our vision is that as a fleet manager is looking at his or her fleet coming into port here in Port of LA or Long Beach, they can see as they enter those emission control areas, is that vessel compliant? Is it not compliant? And if it's not, I know exactly what's wrong so that I can have the parts ready as the ship reaches dock and berths, that I can turn that around quickly and be back in compliance and my ship's out for the next run. So that's our vision for GreenLink Systems and for maintaining compliance in this new era of stricter regulations and lower pollution. And I think we can all get there. I think that we're well on our way and we're here to help. So we appreciate the opportunity again, Stan, for being here, and thank you all very much.